Hi, Basu.
Hello there.
Yes, nice to see you here. Hi, Rania.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
Good. How about you?
Well, thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll wait for a couple of minutes and then we can kick start. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Am I visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Now you're visible.
Audio, video, all functioning. Thank you.
Yes.
So how's everyone? It's been long, 2 fruitful days, I would presume.
Indeed. Keeping up, taking through the sessions starting yesterday.
Yes,
And this is finally, the last session. And
I know.
the best of the sessions. Yeah. So
Thank you. So this is probably the concluding session of the entire program, right?
Sorry?
This is the concluding panel discussion of the entire 2-day program.
That's correct. We are rounding up after this session. Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
How do I pronounce Admesu? Sorry.
You're on track.
I know
Admasu.
Admasu. Okay, it could have been better from my side. Admasu, right? I'm Shubhada.
Subhada.
Shubhada, yeah.
Shubhada. Okay.
And you would be Rania or Rania?
Rania.
Rania.
Yeah, thank you.
All is easy to navigate.
Great. So we still have like 2 minutes or something?
Sorry?
I'm saying we still have like 2 minutes, right?
Yes, almost a minute now. Almost a minute. It's close to, yeah.
So Dr. Shubhada, you're actually silent in the middle so that I don't forget. You're at Shubhada.
Shubhada. You
Okay,
can
good.
call me Shubhada. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Dr.
If it is a tongue twister, then Dr. Rao, but Shubhada is even better. Let's
No
keep it
problem.
informal. Let's keep it slightly informal.
Your pronunciation of names can get a little bit tricky between countries. Huh?
Go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone for making time to join us for this special session for the Global Economic Ideas Festival, the GEIF 2022. This has been an initiative of the ICCE, the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. And for the benefit of those that are joining us for the first time, of course, in the past day and even earlier today, we've shared more information about the ICCE. But for the benefit of those joining us for the first time, the ICCE is a professional body that is providing qualification for economists. So anyone that is currently working as an economist or aspiring to become an economist, or probably your current role or your future role requires that you have some knowledge in economics. So not necessarily that you're going to work as an economist, but based on the role that you're playing, whether at the entry or mid-level or senior management level, it requires that you have some basic knowledge in economics. Then, of course, the ICC will be your preferred professional qualification to obtain. And we operate like other professional bodies that are well known in other disciplines, like in accounting or finance or marketing. So it's membership based. You join the ICC as a member or as a learner. You go through some series of curriculum that we have. All the details are available on our website. So in most of the emails that we've been sending, you can follow it and get more information about the ICCE. Now, one other thing that we do is to create more platforms to engineer conversations that are relevant, and we believe that can go a long way to help create the kind of world that we all deserve or desire to live in. And one of such is the GEIF. So this is the annual global conference of the ICCE. So it's going to be held annually. This is the first edition, originally planned to be held in person, of course, but due to circumstances beyond our control, we have to move it virtual. We are hopeful that in 2023, we're going to have GEIF as a physical event. This year was chaired by Dr. Frank Luthier, who is currently with the Southbridge group. So she chaired, and of course co-chaired by Professor Pradhan, the chairperson of the Governing Council of ICCE. And I've been able to assist in and out to make sure that we have the GEIF for the first time, a virtual edition. So you're all welcome to day 2 of the GEIF, which started yesterday. And finally, we have the last, and as they say, we always say the last, the best for the last. And so we are very hopeful that we're going to be having a very insightful conversation on yet another important topic, which the whole globalization and global economy actually, sits back on, and of course, engineer everything that we see around us. So we're very fortunate to have experienced individuals that are joining us for this conversation. And then to help us go through the session is a very own. I mean, she's part of the ICC as a learner. She currently works with the Trade and Development Bank, of course, which now she has her boss here with us as well. So welcome, Rania, to lead us in the conversation on trade and of course, issue of globalization and trade. So Rania, please, you have the floor now to take us through the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here, definitely. And first, allow me to introduce the esteemed panel. We have today, we're very fortunate actually to discuss a topic with experienced leaders, President Masood Adesi and Dr. Shubhada Rao. I'll be a bit biased and I'll start with ladies first and I'll introduce Dr. Rao. Dr. Rao is a founder of Quantico and brings with her over 32 years of experience in academia and industry. She's a gold medalist and a PhD in economics from the University of Mumbai. She has worked as chief economist with financial sector entities. She also served for 14 years at Yes Bank. Dr. Shubhada has held positions in various industry associations, chairperson Economics Committee and Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry, co-chair Economics Committee at ASOCHAM and member of CII National Economic Policy Council and member Monetary Policy Group, Indian Banks Association. We're very privileged, Dr. Rao. President Masood, it was a pleasure as usual. And President Masood is President Emeritus and Group Managing Director of Eastern and Southern African Trade Development Bank. President Masood is a well-known international banker and business leader with over 35 years of experience at board and executive levels globally and in Africa. Since he joined TDB back in 2012, the bank grew its assets from 1 billion to 8 billion while driving higher impact in the 22 member states it serves. Mr. Tadesio also serves on various boards and industry bodies, including the US Corporate Council on Africa, and he's a recipient of several industry honors and awards, notably African Banker of the Year and African Business Leader of the Year. Our topic today actually is the future of global trade, how to build resilience amidst crisis. That's one that had been on the minds of every economist and policymakers as we speak. Globalization is one aspect we are now rethinking through. From ancient Silk Roads to modern day trade agreement, globalization had always been here one way or another. Globalization is the reason we have intergovernmental organizations and intergovernmental treaties and multinational corporations. After 30 years of prosperity, though, globalization is facing an existential crisis. The pre-COVID-19 multilateral order was riddled with problems, often criticized for causing unequal economic growth, shutting down local businesses, and being one catalyst to the spreading of recessions across the nation. Nevertheless, for many, it's vital to restore globalization. Otherwise, the lure of self-sufficiency will sweep the world into a dark age. Now, we are very privileged because the panel here will explore with us what business want to see from new generation of global institutions, as well as dealing with the threats around globalization. May I start with my first question, please? What is your broader perspective on the current global trade architecture? Dr. Rao and President Masood. Again, maybe I'll favor Dr. Rao for being a woman, so ladies first. Dr. Rao, please.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Paul, for setting the context, and thank you, Rana, for introducing so generously. Yes, I think we are meeting at a very critical juncture of what's happening across the globe. The dynamics of trade began to alter since 2018 with trade disruptions between US and China. Easily one could identify them as the largest producer and largest consumer. And since 2018, we have seen a fair degree of disruptions emerging in the global trade landscape. Quickly on the heels of that, we had the pandemic, and as if these two events were not enough, we are now facing even further debilitating momentum thanks to the Russia-Ukraine tensions. So put all of these three events together, it's natural to question that how are we going to review the global trade architecture in its current form? What has gone wrong, perhaps, if you look at the rear view, and what could get corrected if we want to ensure that the global trade, which has been a significantly large engine for growth, for not just developed economies, but more importantly, for less developed and emerging market economies. How do we rev up this trade engine altogether once again? There are few factors that, learnings, if you may say so, from the past, where perhaps the multilateral trade organization perhaps started to fall short. And that's why there were so many disputes, so many uncertainties around the effective implementation of the treaties, predominantly because the basic goal, that of having a more inclusive, a more equitable kind of a platform, was falling short of the ultimate objective. We still had large degrees of inequality, trade negotiations perhaps leaning more towards the mightier players in the organization, leading to the lesser, weaker players, even further weaker in the negotiations part of it. So that rear view observation does come in handy when we discuss the future. Obviously, the pandemic made a very obvious statement through absolutely dramatic disruptions in supply chains in the first year of pandemic. No doubt the supply chains, the global supply chains, began to restore themselves to some extent possible, but the damage had been done, and that set the global economies to thinking that were they over depending on just one country or just one region for securing their components into the manufacturing supply chains and value chains. So that was question number one, which came forth, was over reliance, over dependence on one particular country or region for keeping their domestic economic activity relatively undisrupted. The second, and perhaps I think a more recent phenomenon that one observed in the world was, do we really need to review the rebalancing of the economies thanks to geopolitics? So one was pandemic related, which was more economic outcome driven. And the second was post the Russia-Ukraine conflict, emerged more in the form of the geopolitics. And that perhaps led to a very hastened pace of redrawing a print of who should be nearshored or friendshored in the global trade agreements and so on. And that is what is perhaps we are seeing in the recent months and recent weeks. So coming to the question of how should one view the current global trade architecture, it's going to be a very clear message. One, that involves and that leads to a more inclusive outcome once these near-term disruptions are perhaps in abeyance or in control or managed better. So the post disruptions, the trade community, the trading community in the world should perhaps look at revisiting and rejuvenating the agenda of inclusiveness and a recalibration of the trading partners, be it emerging economies, less developed economies, and advanced economies, securing resources, natural resources. And third element would be all of this has to be viewed from the prism of environmental challenges. With COP27, the themes have emerged that, trade needs to look at even more urgently and immediately the needs and requirements of not just trade, but perhaps associated with that, the investment flows. So all of it put together, I would say the three tenets for the new global trade architecture would be resting on these three platforms, these three critical factors, that of inclusiveness, that of rebalancing the powers in the trade negotiations, fully recognizing the importance of the markets vis-a-vis suppliers, and third, of course, putting all of this in the realm of new geopolitics, new environment, and of course, the new economic paradigm shifts that we are currently witnessing. I think I'll stop here with my first comments and leave it to Admasu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. This is very insightful. And now, President Admasu, if you would just give us your thoughts regarding the current global trade architecture and what do you think about for the time being? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rania. And again, it's a pleasure to be here in this panel. I think it's good that I'm coming after Dr. Rao, not because she's a woman, but because she's very informed and has covered all the ground really in terms of the big picture. From a banker's perspective, the one thing that becomes very clear is we are seeing turbulence. And turbulence is partly being understood in a context of dependency, very high levels of concentration of sourcing, which has created discomfort and insecurity of supply. And that of course is obviously an issue. I think it doesn't matter which angle you look at it from. You could look at it from a trading system perspective, or even a healthy banking and portfolio management perspective, where diversification is a very healthy thing to have. And so the global architecture that we have today has evolved over many, many years, 75 so years. And it started, of course, in a very rudimentary fashion, and it's kind of built up over the years. And today we have the WTO. And globalization, as we've known it, has delivered a great amount of benefits for so many. We've seen how it's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So the efficiency that has come with the global trading system as we've known it has really added a great deal of value to the global economic community by and large. Not everybody has benefited as much, of course, we know. The biggest economies have been the biggest beneficiaries. I think Europe also has been, by and large, a very strong beneficiary, but they also have benefited from very strong intra-regional trade. I think the turbulence that we are observing, at this point in time, has a lot to do with some of the shocks we've seen and some of the geopolitics that Dr. Rao has referred to. And I think really that speaks to the issue that I mentioned earlier on of there being too much concentration in sourcing, right? And I think the global system of trading, the rules-based order, can actually still thrive very well with an open architecture, but obviously allowing businesses and economies to reflect better and do what businesses always do, which is ensure that you have healthy diversification. And I think, if some of these reshoring or friendshoring issues go too far, it's not just going to be a natural reaction to over-concentration. It's going to be policy-induced that could end up to, in a race to the bottom, as it were. And so this is where I think there is a need for a lot of maturity and conscientiousness as global leaders. Try to respond to the legitimate concerns that are out there around being too dependent. Nobody likes dependency. It's not a healthy thing in any particular perspective. And so that can be addressed in a meaningful way, but in a reasonable manner that does not actually create unintended harmful effects. We've seen what intense deglobalization has done in the past. It's been a very ugly phenomenon. And it doesn't end with trade. It tends to morph into other things. So I think there's quite a bit of risk here that needs to be considered as leaders and policymakers try to find a better way forward for the global trading system. From an African perspective, I mean, we see that there's a great deal of opportunity from this necessity of diversification, because Africa is participating very, very little in the global production system. And so we feel that in addition to deconcentration efforts, there's also a natural attraction to shifting some of the investment locations to Africa, so that some of the advantages that we have in terms of inputs, labor in particular, but also down the line, I think energy costs will be quite attractive in Africa from various technological developments and large-scale energy development projects. So I think there could be a healthy way forward without us throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you, Mr. President. And on this note, actually, while we still have you with us, how about if we can discuss the fact about multilateralism? Now that we have you on board, it's being now challenged. There are doubts about the function of our current trading system and are particularly pronounced. How can a policy play a role in shaping the future of the ailing trading system? What are your thoughts regarding this? And of course, I know that you definitely are well vested in this category, so you can also help us with the what is happening now with the FCFTA, which is now taking place. It has been a new business treaty, and of course, I know that you are very well involved with. If you can share your thoughts, this would. Thank you.
Yes, Rania, I think clearly the big overarching thrust around promoting a more diversified global production system, needs to be supported through various other efforts. Infrastructure development is clearly one of them, but we also, of course, need an institutional framework that actually facilitates more trade. And here, in the context of fairness and inclusiveness, there's always a consideration around what regions that have very particular challenges can actually help overcome those specificities. So in the context of Africa, fragmentation is a big problem. You have a lot of landlocked countries, you have a lot of tiny countries. And so what the AFCFTA does is it creates, obviously a much bigger economic community that then makes it more interesting and more feasible for investors to start locating some of their production in African centers, where whether it's big cities or export processing zones or industrial development zones. I mean, there's a lot to be done, but I think Africa is beginning to really get much more serious about addressing some of these disadvantages, so that at least global investors can take a more serious look at the African landscape. I think the international community has I think an interest as well to help ensure that there is a bit more inclusiveness, so supporting some of these efforts in various ways would be very helpful. I think the negotiations point that Dr. Rao has referred to is one area where, obviously, if you're still a developing country that doesn't have a lot of experience around negotiating various issues around trading regimes and all of the dynamics that come out when there's interstate issues that arise, I think this is where we can benefit from a lot of institutional support from other parts of the world that have much more practical experience. But at least, on the institutional framework side, we've made very bold steps. Of course, these are just baby steps. It's the first chapter in our story of creating a bigger African market. There's a lot to be done, and of course, Africa is taking its responsibility seriously. But we, of course, can't do it alone. To be honest, there's so much heavy lifting to be done, especially on the infrastructure side. I think the other point here is, there is the climate context, which is increasingly a global challenge, right? We know the world is struggling to find ways to get more traction to address climate change. And I think, again, here in terms of the world trading system, there can be a lot done to minimize the carbon footprints that get generated by very, very long supply chains that really don't always make sense, really, when you look at it from a consumption perspective and the cost of logistics and shipping. So I think, building smaller regional supply chains would also help reduce it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. And on the same note, Dr. Rao, I would like to actually discuss the multilateralism for Indian businesses, actually. What do you think about it? And in terms of the African-Indian relations, how do you think this can be dealt with? Because I know that India are well vested into the opportunities that can be found in Africa, and there are several initiatives like African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and also been very interesting for the Indian economy and policymakers. So if you can just like guide us also, what do you think and how do you think we can like improve, or how can we take it from here?
Sure. I think that's a very, very pertinent point, that at a juncture where we are looking at what Masu also alluded to earlier, is diversification is the theme, and avoid over concentration of either just the trade or investment. Both are going to be detrimental for the long-term durability and sustainability if you remain concentrated at one particular sphere of activity. So from India's vantage point, I think partnering new regions, new continents, including that of Africa, is going to be very critical for expanding its global partnership footprint. India, as you are aware, is a huge population base of 1.4 billion people. So while its trade is extremely critical in taking this, harnessing this potential far better, the domestic consumption continues to remain a very big story. So obviously our dependence on large resource requirement, considering the fact that India, like many other economies, would like to secure its supply chains, like to secure its international trade through diversification and make the domestic economy more resilient. I think resources, one area where India and Africa, more coming from Africa into India, the commodities could play a big role. From India, I think the less discussed perhaps in today's discussion has been its natural advantage through the digital strength that India has been able to showcase and demonstrate, not just domestically, but to the world, that is a simple thing like payments, the ease with which and the transparency and the security with which the digital payments have taken a center stage in settling the domestic payment systems and taking it globally forward is one thing perhaps India could definitely get Africa to adopt in a much larger manner. It's not just productive and cost efficient, but most importantly, it allows a platform of inclusiveness coming in a big way. And that is what perhaps India and Africa would aspire together, that the basic agenda of inclusiveness, not just within the world, but domestically as well. As you know, post these two big events of pandemic and the conflict, and prior to that also, India has in recent years focused on, harnessing the mutual strengths of different regions alongside India. So as a result, you have seen spate of either bilateral or regional treaties taking place where India is central in its partnership. In recent times, there was a conclusion of partnership with UAE, and as recent as yesterday with Australia, it was cleared in Australia. We have several such treaties and agreements, trade agreements in the pipeline, which currently I would think are with UK, Canada, EU, Israel, and of course, Africa is one of the key partnership regions, where the idea is not just to focus on merchandise trade, but importantly on services. Trade, we all know, India and Africa have already a fair degree of, I would say, relation, but not as much as the potential promises to be. So there's a lot which can get done through merchandise trade, but I would think a larger beneficiary platform would be through services from India to Africa. And Africa, within Africa, we've seen some nations also adopt technology, to maximize the welfare of its people, of its population. So perhaps from where I see in the vantage point of India, India and South Africa relationship is still to a fair degree undertapped, and it has a huge potential to grow. If I were to put a 3 to 5 to 10 year horizon, I think, unfortunately, but that's the reality, that at least in the near term, and when I say near term, till such time that WTO gets its, currently WTO is in its execution avatar. It perhaps, once these immediate discussions of tension are over, perhaps the more of the focus would be on the judicial and the regulatory kind of frameworks getting revisited and reformatted. But until such time that we are going to see a short-term and near-term resurgence of closer treaties with friendshoring and nearshoring, as we earlier spoke of, with like-minded regions and geographies to look after mutual interests to benefit the economies. So I would think that there are enough areas to secure partnerships between India and Africa, and not just India and Africa, with India at sitting at perhaps in a geopolitical sphere at a very critical placement, has tremendous role to play, not just for the region, but perhaps assume leadership position with spearheading a whole lot of new globalized kind of a platform, and not just look at it from a regional factions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. President Maso, if we take a look at the international trade being hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and now the Russia and Ukraine war, what in your mind do you think that the policymakers should do immediately to actually prepare for the looming threats? And I'm actually asking because of the immediate threat that we're facing with the climate change, and because of the COP27 that I know that you have attended. I'm sure that you have lots of thoughts to share with on such a note, and we would like to know from your expertise, please. Thank you.
Well, it's a very simple reaction. The best way of putting it is don't overshoot policy action, because I think we've seen oftentimes policymakers get a bit itchy on the trigger, and they kind of forget that policies don't always produce outcomes very quickly. So I think there should be some restraint on the policymaking side, not to take deeper protectionist measures in a way that interferes, I think, with the natural order of healthy cross-border investment and efficiency seeking. So I think that's my basic reaction. I think we've seen that there has been very strong reactions in big economies through the points that have been raised earlier on, the nearshoring, friendshoring, the whole idea of trusted trade being thrown around. I mean, this can result in knee-jerk reactions, and I think we've seen from history how this can cascade into bigger problems. So I think restraint is the order of the day. Not to say one should be just laissez-faire. I think we know that there are some very sensitive sectors where countries have a legitimate concern to ensure that they're not overexposed to being overconcentrated. And I think that there's enough room within the global system now to allow for that healthy diversification, without policymakers overshooting and introducing a major deglobalization process that would really cause the world a lot of damage, especially in the climate world, right? Because we know that the world has to be cooperative, right? Sovereigns across the global spectrum, especially the big boys and girls, if they don't cooperate, we can kiss the climate goodbye. So yeah, that's my fear, as a policy overshoot.
Well, that's a very interesting thought. May I have your thought if the new trend can affect somehow these SMEs, or can we benefit from SMEs into the climate change as well, if combating or challenges? What do you think we can do for this as well? Is this something that we can also take into consideration? Because there have been several voices that SMEs might be heard from the likes of the new trends. But I know that definitely you have been one that had been advocating for SMEs, and you have already established one of the programs, and you have been very well conscious about it. So what do you think, how can we work for this through our combating and policy making?
Is this to Dr. Gao or myself?
No, it was actually to yourself. If you can help with this one, thank you.
Yeah, well, you know, the SME space is definitely not uniform, as we know. So different sectors have different qualities and characteristics. Some are very local, and others do have quite a bit of reliance on local value chains. Tourism is one area in particular, for instance, where you know, we see certain countries have been hit very hard from cutbacks in tourism. I think it's not just SMEs, but also larger businesses. So I think the climate issue, it really depends on the specific sector. I think food security will benefit SMEs in a pretty big way, because clearly there is a very legitimate concern about not relying too much on local value chains. But I think some other sectors can be hurt. But fortunately, the ICT world, with all this wonderful connectivity we have, references to trade and services, as Dr. Gao said, I think this is an area also that can be very, very beneficial to SMEs, because the barriers to entry, the barriers to trade, whether it's business process outsourcing or providing other services through the global ICT highway, it's a very SME friendly sort of segment of the global economy. So I think there's positivities, but of course energy is an important part of this. SMEs, like everybody else, depend on affordable energy, and so fortunately, if you're just dealing with basic connectivity issues on ICT, it's not a problem. But if you're an SME that's trying to build cryptocurrencies and mining Bitcoin, then as an SME you need low-cost energy. Otherwise, you won't be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If I may add something here, from India experience, not to do with climate change and impact on SMEs, but how do we best harness and maximize the growth potential of SMEs? Traditionally, we all know that, lack of adequate financing, lack of adequate market access. I think these become very important issues for SMEs, not just in India, perhaps globally also. And this is where I believe that technology plays a big role. And recently you may have heard that India did introduce something like a platform like an ONDC, which is nothing but open network for digital commerce, essentially connecting SMEs to an e-commerce platform through digital networks. And that perhaps helps as one of the biggest growth enablers for SMEs, because at the end of the day, SMEs do need to be able to find market access in a more efficient manner. And to my mind, India's example of connecting a whole lot of SME businesses through the platform of ONDC. It's early days yet, but I think it's going to be a very, very beneficial lesson, not just for us in India, but also for the world, to see how best it has been able to harness the potential of SME growth. So once again, marrying digital and to the less privileged segments of the manufacturing perhaps would be one way of unlocking the growth potential for these.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. This is very insightful indeed. Thank you. And I think this is, we might have a few questions from the Q&A. Unfortunately, I can't see them now. Paul, can you see them?
I can see, I can help with that, if you don't mind.
Yes.
So I think the first question is from anonymous audience. So he's asking, will you recommend the continent as a whole, looking out for some specific industries and approaching China to invest in? I'm sure you're referring to Africa. For example, the building of an ICT factory on the continent to supply semiconductors and microchip for the ICT industry, or even a lithium battery plant to support the solar energy industry. If so, who should take the initiative? Is it the AU, is it the AFDB, Afreximbank, or the AFCFTA secretary? I think this will go to maybe President Masu. So he's asking, I mean, would you recommend Africa to look out for some specific industries and approaching China to invest in? So Africa focus on a specific industry. Is it likely or possible to, more like focus on China to come and invest in it? For example, whether it's in a factory in ICT, and if in such case, who will be which institution will take up the initiative? Is it AU, is it AFDB, Afreximbank, or the AFCFTA secretariat that will, kind of initiate such, situation for the continent? Yeah.
Well, the question that's been raised is not a new one. It's a topic that's quite significant these days, because there is a lot of thinking around how more value addition can be brought to the African landscape, given our natural endowment and some of these resources. The bottom line is one role player cannot do it. All the entities that were referred to have a role to play. But then countries themselves, right? I think sometimes we sometimes get lost in the imagination of huge Pan-African institutions with big names and quite a bit of muscle. But the bottom line is the economies are still very local and national in character. So I would add to the list that was given countries as well, ensuring that they create the right investment climate and appropriate incentives to actually attract those kinds of industries. I think it's a complicated world around trade in terms of how much you can force, resource extractors to actually add value on your territory. But you could actually create incentives to do that. And I think this is where a blend of advocacy and other kinds of moral suasion and banks like ourselves, of course, the others clearly have an important role to play. We discussed this quite intensively just a month or so ago in Abidjan at the African Investment Forum, where we're saying, how do we join forces to actually really try to attract producers, the semiconductor folks, but also batteries. We even went beyond that and spoke about solar panels. How do we actually get production on our land shores? And I think when you look at solar panels, it's sand and natural gas. Those are the two major ingredients. We have lots of sand and we have quite a bit of natural gas these days too, all across. So yeah, I think in the end it's about incentives and helping businesses come up with feasible investment plans. But it's easier said than done, right? So we all have to really be credible in how we put this across. Talking is easy, as we know.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Rao, we want to comment on that, or I should move to the next question?
This is on the WTO versus regional treaties, right?
Okay, so maybe then, so it's asking, is the WTO being overtaken by interregional economic corporations?
Yeah.
So yeah.
So
maybe
maybe I could attempt to respond to that question first.
Yeah, sure.
You know, as I said in my opening comments, that thanks to those big two events that we have been recently experiencing and going through, that is the pandemic and the geopolitics, the need and the urgent need for quickly assessing regional treaties and putting them into action has perhaps become a priority for many of the economies across the world. And that is why we have seen a flurry and intensity of activity in putting so many trade treaties together in last 2 or 3 years. So yes, in the near term, there would be perhaps a greater temptation, and not just temptation. At the end of the day, every economy would want to look how best is it going to maximize its domestic welfare first. And that, you know, perhaps necessitates a quicker way of dealing with global commerce by engaging in local, bilateral, and regional treaties. Having said, can one belittle or undermine the importance of WTO on a durable basis? Obviously not. I mean, why the WTO was created and why did it flourish so well? Of course, it had its, you know, some areas of weaknesses, but you cannot undermine a global platform like a WTO. We all know, and I think the recent evidence has also data shows that any amount of trade uncertainty does lead to a fair degree of domestic, you know, I would say less than optimal solutions, be it in investment. I think there's a very interesting paper researched by IMF, which says that every trade uncertainty leads to an uncertainty or delay in domestic investment by 3.5 percentage points with a lag of 2 years. It leads to a reduction in domestic output or GDP by 40 basis points and domestic unemployment by 1%. And regarding investment, the problem is more pronounced with respect to emerging economies. So clearly, trade is a centerpiece of growth. Nobody can deny that. As I said, there have been near-term compulsions, which have perhaps, and more so, more than pandemic, I would think the geopolitics has had a larger role to play in necessitating, you know, finding the right-minded partners to take a path of mutual benefit and growth for both the regions. Once you have a relative stability emerging, particularly on the geopolitics side, I would think there would be some semblance of normalcy coming back into the picture. But I'm afraid in the near term, this is what we all perhaps are going to be looking out for is, you know, which are the regions which can be best partnered with for mutual benefit and mutual gain in terms of their own economic welfare.
All right, thank you very much, Rao. So this question is answered. So I'm going to ask the next question, which will go to, I think we'll take opinions from both speakers. So it's asked by George. So thank you for the insightful discussion. So the question is, how is the current global trade architecture, and more specifically trade treaties like the one we just discussed about the free trade area, being used to address issue of economic inequalities? So that's what the question is. So trade and economic inequality. So maybe I'll start with President Masu, if you are here. Maybe you can start with that before Dr. Rao will come in. It says about trade, global trade architecture, and issue about economic inequalities. How are these two being addressed? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there have been some efforts through the aid for trade programs we've seen. I think there's other ways of also ensuring that there's better conditions in place to actually attract investment to areas that don't have much of it. So I think, as we mentioned earlier on, it has to do with creating infrastructure, both logistics types infrastructure, but ensuring there's adequate energy that's competitive, so that you can attract that investment and then create a lot of jobs and local economic linkages on the ground through local sourcing. That would give those areas that are neglected and marginalized much more economic opportunity, right? So we do know really how it can be done. We've seen how countries like India and China and earlier the Asian tigers have really grown massively through a trade driven program, right, of economic development. So we do know how it can be done, but I think it's not always easy to build that economic environment and institutional environment where it creates that incentive. But that's where the heavy lifting needs to be done.
Dr. Rao, you may have your...
Yes, I think there is one aspect that perhaps also needs to get addressed comprehensively, particularly when we are talking of inequalities, is the urgent need for securing food and energy security. We have seen both these aspects becoming fairly vulnerable in recent years, and it's going to be extremely important from the global trade perspective to address these two critical elements of inequality. We know food security becomes extremely important, securing food supplies becomes extremely important, and where India has been playing fairly, I would say, a leadership role in trying to ensure to bridge that gap as far as food is concerned. In energy, I must say that India has been a large importer, and thanks to all these recent developments, India has been perhaps rushing to make its energy security as one of the critical factors to look at, where I would say that issues like nearshoring and friendshoring, I'm sorry if I'm repeating it often, but unfortunately in the new environment, these have become actually more relevant, at least in the near term, till world stabilizes and we all go back as one big family to the WTO to renegotiate, to look at securing greater equitable distribution and benefits of trade and make it more inclusive. But I am afraid that two factors that we really need to perhaps lay the biggest emphasis on are food and energy. And that is where the trade systems will need to work slightly harder to ensure that the world is not, fraught with these kind of unequal arrangements at this point in time.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So I think that question is answered. So I'm asking the next question, which is also from Joyce. So she's asking, how can developing countries, such as in Africa and Asia, reposition their economies to build positive trade balance vis-a-vis developed economies? So you say that currently most, if not all countries in emerging market are running negative trade balances. So how can that issue be addressed for emerging economies? So any of you can start, yeah.
Very quickly, Paul, I think Dr. Rao has already touched on the answer to that question, because the trade imbalances are driven by a number of sectors. Energy is a big one, as we've heard, but there's also the food space, right? In the Africa context in particular, it's criminal that we're importing so much food, despite the vast abundant land and resources we have. That's very pro-agriculture. It's just one specific point in the example. It's over $100 billion we spend per annum importing food. It's outrageous. It's one thing to import semiconductors. It's another thing to import maize, which anybody can produce, really. I mean, these are the things that really require. Unfortunately, the continent has been putting a great deal of premium on dealing with some of these low-lying fruit areas that can generate, some improvements on the trade imbalances. The energy area is a bit more complex than food. That requires heavy scale investments if you're going to try to use your own sort of fossil fuels, or whether it's going to be renewable energy that you want to use to kind of minimize your dependence on fossil fuels. Whether you go renewable, or whether you produce natural gas on scale, or whether you actually also produce a little bit of dirty stuff because you're importing it in any case, and you are burning that fossil fuel in any case, you might as well burn the stuff that's in your ground rather than, generate even greater carbon footprints importing these fossil fuels from thousands of kilometers away, and you're actually having multiple negative effects on the global climate. I mean, if you go back, if you actually project to 2050, in 2050 already the global energy mix will have more or less 50% of fossil fuels. That in the future, right? So I mean, if we're still going to be consuming 50% of fossil fuels, why not consume your own if you have it? Because that would help deal with the imbalances. Countries like Mozambique, Egypt, Tanzania, these countries have discovered significant amounts of natural gas. And there's sometimes oil there, some of it can be converted. Not to say that one is pro fossil fuel necessarily, but if that is a given reality, and if that's going to be your reality for the next 20, 30 years, there will always be a legacy of a certain amount of that you will be consuming. Consume your own, it helps with the carbon footprint on the logistics, but it also helps with your trade imbalances and allows you to focus your dollars, or your euros or your yen to import equipment, which you need for many other more complicated and sophisticated processes. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
So before we take Dr. Rao's comment on that, I would like to take the last, your last comments, Mr. Masu, since you might have to be joining other session. So maybe we'll take your last comments on this discussion that we had, and then we can end the session with Dr. Rao. Yeah.
Well, just to say, I think it's really welcome to have this kind of interaction, because we're all looking for, deeper international collaboration and partnership to overcome the common global problems that we all face. It's not just the area, of course, of trade issues, but it's pandemics, it's global debt issues, it's the climate, and we all need to collaborate. And unfortunately, there is a lot of duplicity in the world and double standards. And, we need to kind of help everybody come down to ground zero and be a little bit more germane in these international engagements, because we know that there's a credibility problem in the world in terms of international cooperation. And I think these kinds of platforms at least helps sensitize and maybe, nudge the different players along a little bit better, so that we can be more constructive as a global community.
Yes, so it's been awesome having you with us, Mr. Tadesse. It's been fantastic with you, and we appreciate your time and the insight that you've shared with us. And of course, we'll come your way again. Yeah, so thank you very much. So now, Dr. Rao, we'll take your comments on the last question that was raised about the trading balances. And of course, there was another question, maybe we box that in, which is asking about the current, the biggest threat to global trade, today. So on the trading balances, and then the biggest threat to global trade today.
Sure. I think I'll start with where India is positioned today. With 1.4 billion people, it's going to be difficult to imagine to transition from a trade deficit situation to a trade balance positive situation in a hurry. That does not mean that India is not working towards giving adequate and appropriate incentives to those sectors where we have the scope to reduce our disproportionate imports. And when I say that very clearly, I mean energy imports. India has committed to diversify its energy requirements from the traditional fossil fuels, imported fossil fuels and imported petroleum, to increasingly and incrementally create domestic capabilities of generating renewable energy and ensuring that at least 50% of the installed capacity comes from renewable energy sources, be it solar or wind, but predominantly I would say solar would take a lot of lead here. So India has begun well in focusing rightfully so and urgently so in trying to diversify its overdependence on imported energy requirements. Second, I would think that if you remove the energy imports, India has fair degree of capability across board in the manufacturing sector. And the government, rightfully so, about a couple of years ago, introduced incentivizing the domestic manufacturing through something that we call production-linked incentives across 14 or 15 sectors in India, which actually create the capabilities, or which are setting the stage to create capabilities to cater not just to the domestic needs, but also to emerge as exporting hubs for the world. And while automobile, everyone is well aware about, not just automobiles, or you have pharma sector, which in COVID times became fairly, I would say, got showcased very adequately across the world. But more importantly, through high-tech machinery, through electric machinery, through electronic space, be it mobile telephony or some other such items, India is beginning to focus on incentivizing its domestic manufacturing in a manner that we are able to have a more manageable and a more sensible quantum of trade imbalance. And that is easily one of the key focus areas of this government, rightfully so, that where we have the ability and core competency, why not maximize the potential to the fullest? Coming to a situation where we are going to be positive on trade balance, I'm afraid that's going to be aspirational, at least for the next 2 decades. It's unlikely, as I continue to reiterate, that we are a domestic economy with a large population. Our importing requirements are going to be large. So clearly, the transition from a very large trade deficit to a narrower trade deficit has begun and will continue over the next decade or so. Coming back to the focus of what was the second part of the question, Paul? I sort of biggest threat, I think, is if the geopolitical issues persist for longer. That unfortunately and undesirably so would just force for more of a regional flavor to trade agreements. So it is in global interest that earlier there is a closure to these conflicts, the better it would be to come back to a certain sense of normalcy, a semblance of normalcy, to be able to take on where we left off, perhaps before these last 3 years of trade tensions and pandemic and this war or conflict happened. So I wouldn't say it is a threat if you're looking at a long-term perspective, but definitely the prerequisite is going to be a sooner and earlier closure to what's happening around us. If we are able to do that, then perhaps global trade on a multilateral platform should be here to thrive.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll hand over to Rania now so we can wrap it up. I guess, yeah.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Dr. Rao. This has been very inspirational and actually very insightful. I think I speak to myself and I speak for also the ICCE. This has been beneficial, and we're definitely going to go back to you and ask you more questions later on, one-to-one or whatever, because we have enjoyed. And of course, President Basso is always great to have. I'm sorry he had to leave quickly. He has something to catch. And thank you everyone.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to share.
Yes, thank you very much. And this session is recorded as well, so we'll have it available on our YouTube channel, and then we'll share it. But it's been wonderful the last 2 days, working and of course producing this Global Economic Ideas Festival. We will send reports and various discussions that we had via email to everyone that joined us. So until we come your way again, we say a big thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.